Thank you. Thanks for the question. I actually thought in the 90s, particularly 95 to 97, 95 to 98, there was a fair amount of recognition of this. I was encouraged by the United Nations peace process and the level of detail that Western countries, together with their Tajik counterparts, the level of detail and recognition that indeed this wasn't a case of Islamist militancy. So much so that everybody was comfortable with having the IRPT as part of the peace negotiation, as part of, and being institutionalized in the next government, right? So I think the question is what happened since 1997, right? So why in the past 15, almost 20 years now, has the West kind of backed away from this? I mean, I would say it's not universal, right? If you look at U.S. foreign policy, and if you look at people who study Tajikistan within the U.S. government, there's a lot of recognition of exactly the things that I've said. It's just policy itself hasn't been particularly nuanced, and I think you probably can answer this as well as I can. There's been certain demands on U.S. foreign policy, particularly what's going on in Afghanistan, that the attention and I think the resolve to focus on what's going on in Tajikistan just hasn't been there. Tajikistan played a important but not a particularly large role in the U.S. effort in Afghanistan. When you contrast that to Kyrgyzstan and then Uzbekistan 2001, 2005, those were countries that played very important roles. The Tajik role was less, and I just think it kind of went to the back burner for the U.S. government. Now I think it's beginning to assume increasing importance. I think Marlene's right. The fact that we have such a large audience today suggests that people are interested in Tajikistan, and people are concerned. So I'm hoping that there will be a renewed interest. But I think the explanation is probably the geopolitical concerns, the immediate challenges of Afghanistan and Iraq over the past 15 years. I think it wouldn't be exaggeration to say that there is a autocratic club that is emerging in Central Asia, right? So a lot of these governments have shared interests in preventing the uprisings that we saw in North Africa, the uprisings that we saw in 2005 and 2010 in Kyrgyzstan, and there are a group of countries that find it expedient, when I say countries, there's a group of governments that find it expedient to come together and work against these kinds of eventualities or potentialities, right? So I think you're right. I think the union offers some support. I'm not quite sure how robust that support would actually be, but some support, some defense against such uprising. That said, I don't mean to paint Tajikistan as being particularly nefarious and Russia as being particularly nefarious. If you look at Uzbekistan, one of the largest shipments of military equipment that Uzbekistan's received in the past decade just came from the United States, right? So there's a desire among all of these governments to build up capacity to fight. Actually, where I differ with you is capacity. You said radicals or radical Islam. My sense is that the desire is not to fight radical Islamists, but rather to fight the opposition, right? So they're seeking these connections. They're seeking this equipment, not so much because they're scared about radical Islam or militant Islam, but they're concerned about domestic opposition. Right. So why would you go after Kubatov? Now, I don't know who went after Kubatov, but why is this person problematic? He's problematic not because he's an Islamist, but rather because he's an oppositionist. And it's these kinds of folk that I think have the government most worried, not the Islamists. Thanks, Marlene, for the question. I actually don't see Tajikistan and the Tajik government as strong at all, almost on no grounds as strong. It has very weak repressive capacity. It can mobilize troops, but it doesn't mobilize them particularly well, and they get chased out by local.
Immobilized elections, immobilized repression on mosque.
Right. So some things are relatively straightforward for weak governments to do. So it's relatively straightforward to have election fraud. Look, if the Kyrgyz state can have election fraud, then just about any state can have election fraud. So it doesn't take a lot to manipulate. things like that. It takes a lot more to do the kind of things like we saw in Andijan in 2005. And the one thing that we know about repression is if it's going to be effective, it has to be extreme, intense, and brutal. And I don't think the Tajik government can do that right now. I mean, the bigger question is it a good policy on, say, Western government's parts to work with the Tajik state as it currently is to build its capacity? And my answer to that would be no. I view the current Rahmon government as hopeless, is not capable of reform. And even if the president wanted to reform, the system is so entrenched and the patronage networks are so entrenched that look at Gorbachev, 1989. The moment you try to reform it, then you're gone. So I think the bigger question is, can you work to build the capacity of the Tajik state? My answer would be no, not in the current structure of the Tajik state. Rather, what you can do is you can work with the opposition, or you can work with civil society. You can work with watchdog groups that fight against corruption. But trying to build the capacity of the Tajik state at this point is a fool's errand. I don't envy people in the U.S. government who have to work with Tajikistan, right? I mean, that's what governments do. They work with other governments, right? So the U.S. government doesn't have the option of sitting back and saying this is a fool's errand because they have to engage. I mean, I think the question is along what lines do you engage, and there are lots of different kinds of programming that the U.S. government can do, other than programming that would buttress the Rahmon regime, buttress the patronage networks of the Rahmon regime. If I were strictly a foreign policy realist, and my concern was an unstable Tajikistan, I might buy the argument that you want to potentially strengthen the government to prevent that. At the same time, I don't think there's any amount of programming and assistance that can fix the pathologies of the current Rahmon state. So I'm not quite sure on what ends you could work to strengthen this government. Whether or not the Rahmon government collapses this is a dynamic that is internal to the Rahmon government, which can't be influenced, I think, at this point by external assistance. I feel a little bit nervous talking about this because I know Marlene's here and she knows a lot more than I do on this question. I mean, the narrative that one hears, and I intentionally say the narrative that one hears, that's a hedge because I don't buy the narrative, but the narrative that one hears is that Tajik labor migrants go to Russia, they become radicalized, and then from Russia they go to Syria by way of Turkey, right? So that's the narrative that one hears a lot. Or Tajik labor migrants go to Turkey and they somehow become radicalized in Turkey and then they go across the border. There's anecdotal information on this. Understandably, it's hard. I mean, I don't know of any anthropologists or political scientists who are working with ISIS on the ground right now, so I'm not quite sure what the data is like. So what we have are anecdotal stories, often stories that are shared by the Tajik government. So the figures that I gave at the beginning of this presentation are Tajik government figures, right? It's the Interior Ministry of Tajikistan, or figures that we can get from Moscow, from the Russian government. But I have not seen compelling independent work that would suggest that these people are there in any great numbers. I mean, I have no doubt that there are probably some Tajiks, as I also would have no doubt that there are probably some Northern Virginians that are with ISIS right now. I just think we have to be careful of taking a few anecdotal examples and creating this big alarming picture when perhaps there's really no justification for a big alarming picture. Again, I think the Kyrgyz case is instructive here. I think if you look at 2005, Moscow wasn't particularly happy with that leadership change, and then if you look at 2010, the word on the street is maybe Russia had a pretty pronounced hand in what happened. So Moscow certainly has the capacity to affect politics. I have not done a lot of research on, in Kyrgyzstan. I could say more definitively, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of Russian money that is going into political party development in Kyrgyzstan. I know that for a fact because I've worked with the political parties that are being supported by Russia. I don't know as well the Tajik case, and I would love to learn more, and I suspect we will learn more today. But that said, I mean, I think the one thing that's changed is what's happened in Ukraine and Russia's ability to manipulate the politics of Ukraine is a warning shot, I think, to all the former Soviet countries, with the potential exception of the Baltics, although we're not quite sure there, that if they don't fall in line, Moscow has no problem using dirty tricks to achieve the kinds of outcomes it would like to achieve. So I think the union is an example of that. The economic union is an example of Moscow's greater assertion of authority. The intervention in Kyrgyz politics is a clear example. Could a similar thing happen in Tajikistan? I think sure, absolutely. And then of course there's always the challenge of the lever of labor migrants. Now Russia would be shooting itself in the foot if it were to prevent labor migration from Tajikistan. Russia desperately depends on labor migration from Tajikistan, but that's always a lever that Putin can use against Central Asian countries, but Tajikistan in particular.